In business news today, 3 things to know. First, blowout. Jobs report roars past forecasts as the milder weather helped employers add 288,000 jobs, the biggest gains in more than 2 years. Then, spotlight on Nigeria. Another deadly bombing in Nigeria fuels concerns over security as the World Economic Forum prepares for its summit there next week. And countdown to the summer travel season with gas prices expected to rise, how to cut the cost of your trip and have Schmertz as your I don't know what. Rise Xchange starts now. Hello, I'm Julian Phillips in for Andrew the Schmertz. A spring stunner. The jobs report released today blowing past all expectations. U.S. employers added 288,000 jobs in April, the most in 2 years, and the strongest evidence the economy is gaining momentum. The unemployment rate dropped 6.3%. That's down from 6.7% in March, and its lowest level since 2008. And some other good news for the U.S. economy. Orders to U.S. factories advanced strongly in March for a second month, an increase of 1.1% after a boost of 1.5% in February. Well, those gains followed 2 months of declines in December and January. Well, we'll have more on the economy in a moment, but first let's, of course, take a look at how the market did today. A down day across the board for the markets. The Dow closing at 16,512, the S&P 500 closing at 1881, and the Nasdaq ended the day at 4123. Here's a look at the stocks we are watching today. A consumer rights group says it has filed a nationwide antitrust class action lawsuit against Google, claiming the company illegally monopolized the internet and mobile search market in the United States. Google closing down at $533.87. Well, business-based social networking site LinkedIn says its first quarter revenue rose 46% to $473.2 million from $325 million a year earlier. LinkedIn closing down to $147.73. And shares of the beauty products giant Estee Lauder jumped by more than 4% in earlier trading. This after the company says revenues 1% to $2.55 billion, from $2.29 billion, led by increased sales of fragrances and skincare products. Estee Lauder closing up to $75.62. Now for a look at commodities, oil closing up to $1,298 an ounce and gold closing up to $108 per barrel. Interesting. Well, for more on the jobs report in the economy, Doug Handler, Chief U.S. economist with IHS Global Insight, joins us from Boston. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Julian.
April's employment report showed the most job growth in more than 2 years. Is this evidence that there will be a bounce back in the economy going forward?
A little bit of evidence. We always knew there was going to be a weather-related bounce. We thought it might be in March, but it happened in April, so we'll take it. But the underlying growth rate, subtracting the weather impact, is still pretty good.
Do you think, Doug, that the main reason this report is so strong is that the labor participation rate dropped to its lowest level since 1978, meaning that so many people stopped looking for work?
That data is from the household survey, and those data tend to be really erratic here. So we don't really put that much credence in the results or any of the implications from that data. It's very possible that we could get a bounce back the other way come May. So we'll wait and see on those kinds of conclusions.
And Doug, I want to ask also about jobs. People talk about the number of jobs being added, and of course the administration, because they beat their chest over this. But I guess my question, what kind of jobs are we talking about here?
Well, in this particular release, it was especially good because the gains were very broad-based. Construction jobs were created, a little bit of manufacturing jobs were created, mostly service sector jobs though, but pretty much every sector either held their ground or grew. So that broad-based nature of the recovery really helps us forecast additional growth going forward. It's the sustainability of the job growth that we're really looking for.
Well, Doug, I guess you probably can't argue too much with these numbers, but I look at my town out on Long Island here, and I see store after store closing down. I remember one of the managers of one of the bigger restaurants in town says, look, this weather is going to cause a lot of businesses not to survive this winter. I'm just wondering later down the road, may we see a change in these numbers? Because I see a lot of businesses closing where I live.
Not really in the foreseeable future. You said earlier orders were up, consumer spending is doing well. I think the economy can compensate for the bad weather. It might be taking a little longer than we thought, however. Housing's got to come back. Certainly the consumer has to spend that money that they didn't spend in winter, and apparently the delayed reaction in the employment data suggests that this correction is going to take a little bit of time.
Understood. Do you expect this report to change anything in terms of the Fed policy of tapering?
Not at all. I think they're doing high fives at the Fed here that they got the policy right. They continued the tapering process when they knew the economy was weak in the winter, claiming that it's going to get better in the springtime, and it did. So that tells the folks at the Fed that their policy is exactly right, and I think they'll stay the course for the rest of the year.
We got time for one more question here. It says earlier this week we found that the economic growth was weak in terms of the GDP. I guess my question is, why did the GDP come in weak and the jobs report come in so strong, in your opinion?
Well, one reason is the job growth is covering April, whereas the GDP data cover the first quarter, but the two are related. This bounce back in April on the jobs number suggests that the second quarter GDP growth is really going to have a rebound from the first quarter. First quarter was bad, but we're going to see the payback in a good way in the second quarter.
Okay, well, I hope you're right on that. Doug Handler, thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. U.S. lawmakers push for critical talks over the violence in South Sudan. On Friday, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry strongly urged South Sudan's two main fighting groups to embrace a ceasefire, threatening U.S. sanctions if the violence doesn't stop.
I told President Kiir that the choices that both he and the opposition face are stark and clear, and that the unspeakable human costs that we have seen over the course of the last months, and which could even grow if they fail to sit down, are unacceptable to the global community.
We were going to have James Blue, our Washington Arise News Washington bureau chief, with us. Hopefully we'll get him later. But we're still waiting on the earnings report from Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. Analysts are expecting an increase of $2,172.02 on Class A shares and earnings of $1.45 for Class B shares. Those results out late Friday evening. Tens of thousands of people descended on Omaha, Nebraska this weekend for the company's annual shareholders meeting and to hear the oracle himself, Warren Buffett. The company also announced its energy unit is buying the Canadian power transmission provider Altalank for $2.9 billion. And Chevron taking a 27% dive in profits for the first quarter. The second largest U.S. oil company reporting earnings of $4.6 billion or $2.36 a share, $2.36 a share, missing estimates as its production of oil and natural gas slumped. Well, time now for our business ticker, stories making news around the world. A record number of Americans are now insured under the new health care law, but according to a report released from the White House, only 28% of the new signups are from the 18 to 34-year-old age group, who are key to keeping prices down. While the proportion of insured young people is greater than before the law, analysts hope it reaches the ideal 40% level. Now, General Motors will reportedly compensate all victims of accidents related to malfunctioning ignition switch issues in their cars. The payments were announced even though GM is fighting not to be held illegally responsible for the same accidents. An attorney for the victims said that GM's compensation chief would set up payment plans over the next 30 days, and we're going to keep our eyes on that. AstraZeneca has turned down Pfizer's offer to buy them again, even after Pfizer kicked their asking price up to $106 billion. The maker of Viagra has had its advances rejected twice already, leading them to knock the price up to $84 a share, which would be the biggest purchase of a British company by a foreign entity. This offer is just the latest in a string of major pharmaceutical mergers as well as acquisitions. Well, Seattle Mayor Ed Murray is proposing a $15 minimum wage for his municipality. We've got to move there. Washington State already has the highest minimum wage of any state in the country at $9.32. Now, if passed, the proposal would be double the current federal level of $7.25. What a boost. Well, a U.S. soldier is suing the Army for $100 million over its tattoo policy he claims is unconstitutional. Staff Sergeant Adam C. Thorogood says the Army is stopping him from pursuing his dream of joining a special operations unit because of tattoos. Now, new regulations on a variety of appearance issues, including hair, fingernails, glasses, and tattoos, went into effect in March. Under the new rules, soldiers with tattoos below the knee or elbow are banned from seeking promotion. What about firing an M16? Anyway, well, the Kentucky Derby is this Sunday. But if you want a first-hand look, you better get out your wallet. And it better be a big, fat one, too. Prices at the Derby have been going up year after year. A table for 8 goes for $50,000, the highest ever. Who can afford this? A single seat with a nice view, well, that'll run you $9,300. But don't worry, it's just $60 for regular viewing at the track's infield with the other 80,000 average Joes like you and me. Except you have to bring your own chair. There are no bathrooms, and even though you've paid to get in, you're only able to see the horses on a video screen. That's not so good. Anyway, ahead, more trouble in Nigeria and the impact it's having on the global economy. You're watching Arise Exchange.
If I was building my own news network, I think I'd want broad, in-depth knowledge of important issues throughout the world.
I would want to recruit a fairly diverse staff that had different life experiences before they came to news.
We want to see how we can help ourselves and help benefit other people, and not just see what's up with the celebrities and where they're going and traveling and buying this and buying that.
If I were to build my own news network, it would certainly have to reflect a diversity of culture, because that's the global situation, that's the global reality.
I would probably bring a lot of personal stories, really personal stories from the leaders of all countries.
If I was to build my own news network, I would just have people who from all over who are very connected and diverse.
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
I think news does make people put things in black and white terms, just so that they have a dividing line between what their viewers like and dislike.
When they see a person of color, they either think that they're not going to do anything, they're either on drugs, or they got pregnant at an early age. And I just want to say that that's not true.
It tends to reflect more the interests of the upper income people and the upper income interests.
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
Welcome back. We're going to get to Nigeria in a minute here, but we're going to go back to Washington, D.C., and, of course, our Rise Washington Bureau Chief James Blue. U.S. lawmakers talk about the talks over the violence in South Sudan. On Friday, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry strongly urged South Sudan's 2 main fighting youth groups to embrace a ceasefire, threatening U.S. sanctions if the violence doesn't stop. Well, today, Arise Washington Bureau Chief James Blue joins us from the White House with more. James, welcome.
Hi there, Julian. How are you doing?
Absolutely, we're doing great, James. There is some progress. Did the threat of sanctions actually move things along?
Well, the threat of sanctions must have done something, because Secretary John Kerry, Secretary of State, who is in South Sudan, actually got a commitment from both sides, both leaders, the president of South Sudan and the former vice president, to continue peace negotiations in Ethiopia starting as early as Monday. These peace talks have gone on. I was actually there in January when they started. They've broken off, and the real casualty and the real cost of it, Julian, has been a lot of violence that's taken place in South Sudan. The U.S. has supported this political project, but it's also a potential economic project. South Sudan has 51 billion barrels of oil. Right now, Asian countries are using that, are helping South Sudan get that out. The South Sudanese and the American government were like U.S. companies in there, but no one can go in until there's some type of peace.
Well, you know, the stakes, James, are indeed very high down there, but we're talking about a violence that has been steaming for a long time now. Do you think that these sanctions will help quell that violence?
Well, I think the threat of sanctions has sort of stopped the violence. It's gotten people to the table, and that will, you know, sort of get people who have been taken away from their farms. They weren't able to plant. There's a potential for hunger. But, you know, ceasing the violence, going to talks is certainly the right direction, and that gives the opportunity for business once things settle down.
Absolutely. Of course, South Sudan isn't just a political project, but also a potentially economic one as well.
It is, and that is why the U.S. and some of the big U.S. oil companies are hoping that this indication of peace, this beginning of talks in Ethiopia, could be the opening for future investment and prosperity from that region.
James, I want to talk a little bit about the trouble in Ukraine right now. As you know, Angela Merkel, the head of Germany, met with President Barack Obama, U.S. President Barack Obama today. And from what we understand, James, and maybe you can add some more insight on this, apparently businesses in Germany do not want to impose any stricter sanctions on Russia. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there clearly is a concern because Germany gets so much of its energy from Russia that any further sanctions, the sectoral sanctions that both Merkel and President Obama spoke about today, that would really harshly impact German industry. You know, Europe has come back on the back of German industry, and there's a real sense that if that shakes, the European economy could be impacted. I think the sense that we got today is that the U.S. and the EU, with Germany in the lead, recognize additional sanctions are going to be necessary. You know, in Ukraine, 2 helicopters were shot down today. The Ukrainian military has recognized that they can't do the job. And what President Obama and Angela Merkel said today is that Ukraine has to be for Ukrainians. There's a meeting next week of foreign ministers. There's an election coming up on May 25th. And the hope is that this will give Ukrainians a chance to say, we want to remain free.
Right.
We want our own nation.
All right, James, well, of course, with the reporting from Washington. Thank you so much, James.
Thank you.
The trouble in Nigeria up next when Arise Xchange continues.
Mainstream news has covered all of the issues of the world, which are like this, through a very narrow lens. And at Arise News, we do things different. We cover every culture, every angle. Our mission is to go to these places, to these communities, whether they're in Africa, whether they're in Europe, Asia, the United States, the Caribbean. And we're going to find these stories, and we're going to tell them to our audience. Stories that they probably never heard of before, and stories that they'll find interesting and engaging.
Welcome back. Less than a week before Nigeria hosts the World Economic Forum, the West African nation's biggest financial gathering since anyone can remember, a bomb exploded near the capital in Abuja, killing 19 people and injuring 66 others. Now, this comes on the heels of a bombing a couple of weeks ago in the same town that killed more than 70 people. Now, as Nigeria has recently emerged as the continent's #1 economic power, what effect will this latest violence have on the World Economic Forum? Well, joining us on the phone to discuss the implications is Tony Carroll, Vice President, Manchester Trade. Tony, I've got to ask, what kind of impact will this explosion have on the World Economic Forum? Will this keep leaders and heads of state away?
Well, it may change a lot of people's minds who are on the margin. I suspect those people who are keynote speakers, maybe senior executives, will still come. But I do fear that those on the margins will decide, or perhaps will be told, that they can't come because of security implications. But moreover, having myself recently experienced a World Economic Forum program in Tanzania, the traffic and the coordinating, the security coordinating and net will make it very, very difficult to move around and very intense.
Tony, this is just one thing here. We've got these 2 bombing incidents, but we also have unrest in the northern province of Nigeria, the Boko Haram. We've got about 220 schoolgirls missing. I guess the question is, with Nigeria being in the forefront now as an economic power, with all that's going on there, and I guess some would say even a little bit of political unrest with elections coming, is Nigeria still a viable place for investors to invest?
Well, I think, of course, having said all of that, Nigeria's GDP growth is 7.9%. There are huge opportunities in Nigeria. Consumer goods, real estate development, IT, healthcare. These areas are booming, and particularly in the south. But there is an increasing dualism about Nigeria's economy, that the southern half or third of the country are doing quite well, and the northern 19 states, as they describe them, are really suffering. So there's a duality to the country that is becoming more and more complicated and more concerning.
How has the U.S. Shale oil production impacting Nigeria's ability to export its oil specific to the U.S. and perhaps other countries?
Well, I'm not sure it affects other countries, although there is a constant and steady leakage from the system due to theft and militancy. But the IHS PFC Energy has recently come up with some data that's quite striking. In the last 6 years, Nigerian exports to the United States of crude oil have fallen from 1.3 million barrels a day to zero. Moreover, and tragically ironic, U.S. now provides up to 50% of refined products to the Nigerian market. It's the combination of our own domestic support or supplies, but also Libya is coming on, and of course in those 6 years, quite a bit on stream. It's a closer transportation to the United States. So as was described by IHS, some of that oil is being replaced by Libya, but certainly our domestic supplies have made a big dent.
Well, I've got to ask, I'm kind of scratching my head a little bit here. They have large supplies of crude, and the United States, I guess, is the biggest buyer. But, even though with Libya and other countries, up on board and on tap, it's going to make it more difficult for Nigeria to find other countries to export its oil to?
Well, it's a fungible commodity, and moreover, Nigerian sweet crude is a very preferred product. But having said that, they're going to be forced to be selling on smaller quantities on a spot market. And I think the one area that I think in the exploration and production, is going to be a problem because American companies are stepping away from taking the lead. And, American companies invest in the long term. They bring finance and technology like no other country does. And I think that's going to be a problem in the long-term development of their oil fields.
We've got another development here with Nigeria outside of natural resources. Of course, we have what is called Nollywood. I guess something maybe kind of paralleling Hollywood here. And of course, that generates hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. But outside of that, do you think that's enough to keep Nigeria an economic powerhouse? And do you expect perhaps that South Africa to come back on the scene with all their natural resources and mines? What do you think?
Well, I think the real key to Nigeria's development is its human resource capacity. Half of the graduate degrees in Africa are held by Nigerians. If you take a look at the numbers in the growth of the service economy in Nigeria, banking, accounting, financial services, telecommunications, Nigeria is not only a national but a regional powerhouse. And I think because of its wealth of human capacity, that will be its greatest strength. But, it is a really, right now, in a short and medium term quandary in terms of violence and forthcoming elections in about 10 months' time.
Right. Of course, Nigeria is certainly more than a diamond in the rough, no pun intended. And of course, we're all rooting for them to rise above the latest chaos and, of course, some of the terrorist activities there. Tony, Carroll, I just want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Julian. Bye-bye.
All right. Next, making plans for summer travel. You don't want to miss these cost-saving tips when Arise Xchange returns. Stay with us.
I think news does make people put things in black and white terms just so that they have a dividing line between what their viewers like and dislike.
When they see a person of color, they either think that they're not going to do anything, they're either on drugs or they got pregnant at an early age, and I just want to say that that's not true.
It tends to reflect more the interests of the upper income people and the upper income interests.
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
Well, I guess some of you are old enough to remember. Years ago, you could just pack up the car with the kids and drive to destinations unknown. But that was before astronomical gas prices put a dent in how far you could travel on Route 66. I'm dating myself. Now, forget about catching a flight where you are nickeled and dimed to death before buckling your seatbelt. And a cruise, well, that boat might have some bacteria just waiting to invade your body. Well, health issues aside, it takes a little short of a king's ransom to take a vacation these days. But of course, we here at Arise Xchange have some tips to save you more than a few bucks. Gabe Saglie is Senior Director for Travel Zoo. I call him the vacation savior, and welcome.
Oh, that's quite a title. And it's Route 66. It's coming back. People are doing that. I just have a friend who just finished a L.A. to Chicago trip on Route 66.
They're getting their kicks on Route 66.
Yeah.
And with a tan like yours, I mean, people just waiting
I
to
just
get
stay in
to
Southern
LA.
California. I let my friends go on Route 66, but it's a beautiful, beautiful drive.
Let's get into it now. People taking their cars on vacations, usually the majority of folks do so. What's happening this year, and how can you help them navigate these astronomical gas prices?
Yeah, well, gas prices, I mean, it's funny. I was driving through Malibu a couple of days ago. The cheap stuff, the 87 octane, was $4.99. Now, I may not make a big dent for folks in Malibu proper, but the fact is that in some sectors of the country, we're looking at gas prices between $4.50 and $5. Although AAA does say that for the summer season, it'll drop a penny on average, and it will be the lowest gas price average since 2010. So the news is generally, although we're not seeing dramatic drops, generally good. When you weigh that against airfare, and if you're a family of four or a multi-generational group trying to take a memorable vacation, despite gas prices being in that $3.50 to $4.50 range, depending on where you are, it could be still a pretty viable alternative.
Well, what about Amtrak? What about that possibility? Or maybe even Greyhound, or these new buses where it's like $10, like from New York to Washington, D.C.
Now, you got Megabus that'll do $1 from, let's say, New York to to Toronto, that kind of a thing.
Are they safe alternatives, though, Gabe? I mean,
well, yes, I think a lot of these bus companies, and I know the folks at Megabus are definitely a very safe alternative. I mean, and they can be a very cost-effective alternative as well. This is also, as you mentioned, Amtrak, a great opportunity for Amtrak to revamp its visibility among travelers who may not necessarily think of taking the tracks instead of the skies or the road. So it does open up a little bit of opportunity here for companies that are alternatives to driving and flying to put themselves in the mix.
Okay, flying destinations. Where's the best to go? Stay within the continental United States, travel abroad to Europe, or what can you tell us today?
I saw a figure this week that a third of all the airline tickets available to travel domestically between Memorial Day and Labor Day have already been sold. A third. So,
really?
Yeah, the booking has been very active ever since the beginning of the year. I remember being on the show right after the new year when we were talking about the polar vortex, and we thought maybe that was an anomaly. This has been a long and dragged out winter season for at least 2/3 of the country.
So people are going to spend money
markets.
no matter what.
I think there's a willingness now just to get out of town. And although there are, now for example, domestically, airfare prices are up on average year over year about 4 or 5%. Hawaii, 15%. So some destinations definitely are seeing much more of a pull. Europe is also in big demand right now, but a lot of it is about timing. So if you fly between, say, now and June to Hawaii and after August, say, 20th, you can actually find some deals. But the fact of the matter is we are stuck having to travel in specific times of the year. And in those concentrated periods, prices are higher than they were a year, certainly 2 years ago.
Okay, so in your mind right now, the best getaways in terms of flying to a destination, say, outside the United States?
The Caribbean is going to be still a good bargain over the summer season, particularly places that have a lot of competition on the ground and a lot of airlift. So look at the Bahamas, Dominican Republic, Jamaica. These popular destinations will be good value options. South of the border in Mexico, a lot of new enclaves, new sort of tourism developments are starting to come up, like Huatulco in southeastern mainland Mexico, all of a sudden becoming more of a visible alternative as well, particularly for summer value travel. The deserts, where it's hot, where it's sizzling, it's going to be a good value. So LA might see prices go up, but an hour and a half away in Palm Springs, you're going to find some good values there.
I can imagine.
But about 70% less than you would during the winter months.
And you can just fry yourself in Palm Springs.
Well, there are a lot of shady nooks and crannies in these beautiful resorts. But you have places like Scottsdale where you pay $400 to $500 a night in January, February for 5 diamond resorts. We're looking at rates at $99 or less with added incentives. So some of these, you deal with some of the discomfort of the heat, but some of the values can be pretty dramatic.
All right, Gabe Saglie, thank you so much.
Great to see you.
Join you on a cocktail with a Mai Tai.
Okay.
Next week on Arise Xchange, we take you live to the World Economic Forum in Africa and Abuja, Nigeria, where Xchange Andrew Schmertz will bring you the latest news and interviews of leaders from around the world. Now, for a look at how the markets today, real quickly, the Dow closing at 16,512, the S&P 500 closing at 1881, and the NASDAQ ended the day at 4123. If we can get that graphic up there, Schmertzy again talking about travel, my goodness. Schmertzy in an SUV, I guess we can't get it, but a big head and a big boat. Anyway, quiet Gabe. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. I'm Julian.